So my talk tonight is going to be about JavaScript promises. It's a new way to think sync in an async world. My name is Carrick Long. I am the organizer of the St. Louis Ember.js meetup. I am also the lead front-end developer at Second Street, the company whose office you are currently sitting in. You can find me on the web, on GitHub, on Twitter, or on my own site at carricklong.com. In synchronous JavaScript, we have function composition and error propagation. Everything we're used to is really useful. For example, in this code, get student's return value is the input to get latest grade. Errors will bubble up the stack and they can be caught anywhere. But then we have to write asynchronous code, so that won't always work. Synchronous code will block the UI. We have to talk to the network, so we have XML HTTP request. Thanks, Microsoft. When we get data async, especially with XHRs, we have to use callbacks. Callbacks are simple. Because functions are first-class objects in JavaScript, we can pass them around as values. So we'll often see a callback function passed into another function as an input to hold its output, which makes no sense if you think about it. We conflate our inputs and our outputs. The return values stop mattering. They're not even used here. And error handling is a mess. It's terrible. Errors are inconsistent. In Node.js, you might get an error as the first parameter to your function, your callback function. In jQuery, you have to pass an error handler to your object, and it's inconsistent. You never know with various libraries how they're going to do their callbacks. Plus, if you ever throw an actual exception in any of these, it's going to break down. You're going to crash your application, things will go horribly wrong. But thrown exceptions are supposed to be a valuable control flow mechanism. We're not supposed to ignore them and be afraid of them. So in short, JavaScript is awesome. It can be awesome, but asynchronous is often awkward. Luckily, there's a new way to think sync, even when you're writing asynchronous code, and that is promises. Here's a little taste of what it can look like to write code with promises. So I'm going to go over 4 things today. The first is the basics of the promises, what they are, where they are, how to get them, how to use them. The next part is how to consume your promises. This is if you're using a library like Ember.js or Angular that's based on promises, how you would interact with those. Next is creating the promises. This is how, if you want to write your own library or your own custom code, how you would create your own promises. And if we have time at the end, we'll go through some advanced techniques. I'm going to take a minute here to say, if anybody has questions at any time, please raise your hand or speak up. I'm going to be going through a lot of content really fast, and if you get caught up, just feel free to speak out and ask a question. So the basics of promises are that a promise is an object that promises to eventually do something. This concept has already landed in Chrome and in Firefox. It's coming to ECMAScript 6. It's in the WhatWG's DOM standard already. And if you want to actually use it in the real world, with browsers that people would really use, you can use them with a library. rsvp.js is what Ember uses. It's my favorite. It's small, it's fast, and it follows the spec. Qjs and Bluebird are 2 other popular libraries that add some extra features. Yes?
So is it true that the jQuery, I've read people say that the jQuery implementation of promises is flawed?
It is very flawed, and I will get to that. Okay. You will want to kill it with fire. It's terrible. Real promises are all interoperable. You can use any one of these libraries, you can use them all together, you can use somebody else's helper functions because they will all follow the promises A+ specification. This is what the DOM is using, this is what ECMAScript 6 will use, this is what jQuery completely ignores. So, yes. Any library that follows promises A+ is what you want to use. A promise, like I said, is an object that contains a guarantee that it will eventually do something. It also contains guarantees such as it's always asynchronous. When you pass around callbacks, you never know if that callback will get invoked immediately, or if you're going to have to wait around for it, and that can cause some really obscure bugs. A promise handler will always return another promise, and this is going to allow you to do some pretty cool stuff that I'll get into soon. A promise handler will only ever be called once. There's no chance for your promises to get called 2 or 3 times like they can in certain callback code. But because of this, they're not always the right abstraction. If you're doing some sort of DOM events like click events, of course you're going to want those to happen more than once, so promises won't always be right. I really do believe they're the right abstraction for anything that will ever happen once. That's network calls, that's done ready states, loaded states, anything like that. Also, promises are thenable. You might have heard this word thrown around. Basically, it means that the method you use to interact with promises is called then. So they're thenable. And we'll get into that right here shortly. In addition to having value, promises have a state. So a promise can either be pending, fulfilled, or rejected. Every promise will start pending, even if it's not for an async operation, because that consistency is key. Promises will eventually be fulfilled or rejected depending on the success or error state, respectively. You can often hear the word settled thrown around. It's not a distinct state. It means either fulfilled or rejected. So a promise can only be fulfilled or rejected. It will never be both. It will only be one or the other. And it will only be settled once. You can never go back to being pending, and you can never go from fulfilled to rejected or vice versa. Once your state has gone to either fulfilled or to rejected, it is immutable. When a promise is fulfilled, it has a fulfillment value, and when a promise is rejected, it has a rejection reason. And you can kind of see a parallel towards the synchronous code here. A promise's fulfillment value is much like a return value for a function, and a promise's rejection reason is kind of like a thrown exception in a synchronous function. So this brings us on how we're going to consume promises. In Ember's example, if you ever use Ember data, everything is based on promises because anything could be async. Even Ember itself, when you don't use Ember data, its router is based on promises. So if you return a promise, it will always wait for that promise to resolve before going to that route. Every promise instance has a number of methods we use to interact with it, but then is the main one. To then, you'll pass two functions. One is a fulfillment handler, and the other is a rejection handler. The fulfillment value from, in this example, getJSON, will be passed to onFulfilled, and of course, if getJSON instead rejects, it will be passed to onRejected. If you return a value from the then function, it will create a new fulfilled promise. If you throw a value from your then function, it will instead create a rejected promise. Now, I'm going to make a note here. Just like when you're throwing something in synchronous code, you always want to reject with an error instance because you'll get a stack trace. It's super helpful for debugging. It's also just a best practice. Because these then methods return another promise, you can actually chain then calls. And also, both of the handlers are optional. You'll see my second then does not have a rejection handler, and my third does not have a fulfillment handler. That's okay, because any fulfillment value that is not handled by your next then is just passed on to the next one. Same thing with rejection reasons. To clarify, if getJSON rejects, fulfill1 will never be called, and reject1 will handle that rejection. Assuming reject1 doesn't then rethrow that error for some reason, fulfill2 will then be executed, and assuming fulfill2 doesn't reject, then reject2 will never happen. Yes?
What happens if fulfill2 rejects? Does it reject with a null reason?
It depends on why it depends on the value you throw. So within your fulfill2 handler, whatever you throw becomes the rejection reason that will be passed to reject2.
So did you say if reject1 gets called, it will still continue when you fulfill2?
As long as you don't throw something else, yes. Just like in a catch, once you've caught an error, it's no longer an error and won't bubble up unless you throw it again. Same thing with promises. Once you resolve a failed promise or a rejected promise, it's considered fulfilled. So another way is if getJSON is fine, but fulfill1 throws, reject1 does not get called because each then is a pair of handlers that handles the previous promise. Fulfill2 gets skipped and reject2 handles the thrown error from fulfill1. So it's important to note that if you have a pair of thens, the second function, the rejection handler, is not intended to handle the rejection from the first one. Here's a diagram that will hopefully make this a little clearer. So on the left, we have getJSON and then a single then value that has an onFulfilled and onRejected handler. You can follow the arrows to see the green one means it's a fulfillment value and the red one means it's a rejection value. On the right, if we do getJSON, then onFulfilled, then null onRejected, you'll see that anything that throws from onFulfilled will actually get passed down to onRejected. Also, if you return a promise from then instead of just a value, the next then will wait for that promise to resolve, just like the first then would wait for the first promise to resolve. So in this example, when we get the comments, it may take a few hundred milliseconds because we're making a network call, then extract first ID will happen, and then get comment by ID will happen. But then if that returns a promise, show comment won't happen until the get comment by ID promise resolves. Handlers can be attached at any time, so promises will save their fulfillment value or their rejection reason, even after the promise is settled. So, for example, get JSON, we can just leave it there without a then handler, and it will save that value until you finally attach something to it to handle that. And then, of course, this is such a common pattern, this then null on rejected.
Sorry, can you go back to that?
Yes, I'm sorry.
Okay, so what if in that case something else was long running, and get JSON returned first before finished? Can you do that, or would that mess everything up?
It depends on if something else is an asynchronous call or not. If something else is synchronous and long running, like doing a million math.randoms in a run, it'll just do like any other synchronous call, and this then will have to wait for that synchronous operation to finish. If something else was an async operation, get JSON will be triggered, something else will be triggered immediately, and then this would wait until get JSON fulfilled.
So what you're saying is if a promise is already fulfilled, it's still call that then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, it doesn't matter if your promise has been fulfilled or not. You do not have to do attach.then right away, and you definitely don't have to do it while it's still pending. It doesn't really care.
Could you do multiple promise.thens on it?
Yes, and then it'll just wait for each one in the chain to finish.
So could you check that original promise multiple times for whether or not it's been settled? So could we duplicate that third line there 4 times if we wanted to, and then each onFulfilled would get called?
That's a really good question. I haven't ever tried that. Okay. I'm guessing what would happen is that...
What was the question?
Basically, if we duplicated this line here and attached then to promise directly instead of chaining thens. I've never tried that.
Oh, if the promise stays in state, but...
Right, I'm not sure. It might call it 4 different handlers, or it might just replace the handler. I'm pretty sure it would do the latter. I think it would replace, but that's actually a really good question. Yeah, I've never tried that.
What about if you, kind of similar to this question, you just replaced lines 2 and 3, and the promise hadn't resolved yet, and then you ran something else with a million math rans, and if the promise did resolve while you're still in that synchronous code, would the promise resolve asynchronously at that point, or is it still going to wait for that next operation to finish?
Right, because JavaScript is not multi-threaded, it will have to wait. Anytime you have something synchronous that blocks the thread, you're going to have to wait until the stack is clear before that can resolve. It will queue it up in the stack, but it's still going to have to wait for that synchronous operation to finish. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So attaching a then with no fulfillment handler and just a rejection handler is actually a pretty common pattern. So there's syntactic sugar for it. It's called catch. Just do .catch with onRejected, and that'll be the same as doing then null onRejected. It's just kind of a convenience method. There's also a number of methods that are on the promise constructor itself. Promise.cast is a very important one. It'll cast anything into a promise. If it's a scalar, like a string or a number, it will become a resolved promise with that value. If it's a function, it will execute that function. If the function throws, it will become a rejected promise. If the function returns, it will become a fulfilled promise with that function's return value. And if what you're casting has a then method that isn't actually a proper promise, it will be cast into a real promise. Earlier you mentioned jQuery is wrong, and that's correct. I'm going to take a minute here to just tell everybody, jQuery's idea of promises is wrong. It's based on an early specification of promises before it was all hammered out. It does not match up with what's going into the DOM, and the jQuery developer even said it was coded at 3 a.m. So it's all lies. Don't trust it. Anytime you see a jQuery promise, kill it with cast. Always cast your jQuery promises. Don't even wait for them to resolve. Just right when you do your whatever has a then method, just kill it with fire. All right, back on track. Promise.all is a method that takes an array of promises and will fulfill once every single promise has resolved, or it will reject once any promise rejects. So the first one to reject will cause the entire thing to reject.
Does all cast all of the promises?
Yes, you can actually pass it anything, and it will cast it. Yep.
jQuery.
Yep, it will cast jQuery, it will cast scalars, it will cast anything. So that's really convenient. Promise.race is similar, but the difference is that it will resolve once any of them have resolved. The first one's resolution value will be passed to the success handler. First one to reject will also cause it to reject instead. So when we're creating promises, this happens a little less often in Ember because we tend to just work with promises that are given to us by the framework. But if you're ever writing your own code, or maybe you're not interacting with Ember data, you'll tend to create your own promises. And we do this with the new promise constructor. So this is how you might write a function to collect a user's name synchronously. We prompt, what's your name? If it's null, because if it cancel or if it's empty string, we'll throw a new error. Otherwise, we'll return the name they've given us. To do this with promises, you return a new promise, which takes a single function as its parameter, and that function gets passed two functions, fulfill and reject. They will fulfill or reject the promise. So to fulfill the promise, you'll pass the fulfillment value to fulfill, and to reject the promise, you'll pass the rejection reason to reject. Again, I'm going to make a note here. It's best to, if you're going to reject something, do it with a new error because you can stack trace, and it's just best practice to always do an instance of error. There are also a couple of shortcut methods if you don't want to have to type out a new promise and pass an anonymous function. If you find yourself writing a promise that immediately resolves with something, like this, it's shorter just to write promise.resolve. It'll return a new promise that immediately resolves, just like the long form. There's a similar one for if you're going to write a promise that immediately rejects, and that is promise.reject. Kind of obvious follows there. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
So if I have to get stuff working in Internet Explorer and I just install or bring in RSVP, the .js in my code, and all the syntax is just, I just use the syntax as it is, I don't do anything else.
Almost exactly. If you're using RSVP, everything is namespaced. So anytime you see promise, you would do RSVP.promise. There are a couple of polyfill libraries that wrap RSVP into the global promise object if you'd rather stay with the native syntax. But yeah, I know in RSVP specifically, it's RSVP.promise instead of just promise. I believe with Q, they use Q.promise. I'm not entirely familiar with all the libraries, but
ES6 promise seems to be the one that resolves it with style.
Right. Yeah, so if you use an ECMAScript 6 polyfill, it'll often just check if promise is already an object, and if not, insert your library of choices promise in its place.
So if we have Ember installed, we get RSVP on that, and we have another library to include?
Correct. RSVP is already built into Ember, and it's actually available at Ember.RSVP.promise, because Ember namespace is everything within itself. So yeah, Ember already has RSVP in it. We don't have to include anything extra. It's already an internal dependency. So when it comes to Ember, it's already there for you, but you will have to do Ember.RSVP.promise to access any of this. Any other questions before we move on? Okay. So since we have a little bit of time left, I'm going to get into some more advanced techniques you might do with promises. You won't necessarily do all of these in Ember, but the first one definitely is relevant. Earlier we talked, or in Blake's talk, we saw this.get as a way to access properties. In the side of a promise, fulfillment handler or rejection handler, this is always undefined. That's part of the spec. So if you try to do this.get name inside of your promise, that's going to throw, and that's going to cause you to have a rejected promise. A lot of people get around it by caching this as self or that or various other things. That's a way to do it, but it can get kind of tedious. Instead, I recommend you look at the bind method of the function prototype, or on the function prototype. It's only available in IE9 and up, but there is a pretty short polyfill that's available all over the web. Bind returns the function you use it on, with the difference that the this value when that function gets called is the this value that you pass into bind. Think of it kind of like functions apply, except instead of executing it immediately, it just returns a function that will eventually do that. Also, one thing you have to watch out for is absorbed rejections. If you have a promise chain that doesn't end with a rejection handler, you might be missing some errors. So for example, here, you'll just have a promise sitting there in its rejected state with its values never getting read. It seems a little bit weird, but if you think about it in the synchronous parallel, it's kind of like doing a try block without ever having a catch block. It's possible, it's just a bad idea. So I recommend it, if nothing else, if you don't have a real way to actually handle any errors and you're just trying to catch anything, console.error is a great thing to throw on the end of your promise chains. That way you'll at least see it. And of course, console methods require that this value be console, so you'll need to do console.bind console, or you can do an anonymous function where you just put console.error inside of that. So now I'm going to try and take us back to the very beginning of the presentation when you saw function return values being passed into other functions as parameters like JavaScript should be. So this is how you'll see most promises code written, and this works fine. It's easy to follow. You can see the order of things, and it's great. But if you really want to get into this, it's very possible. Passing functions to functions is where we came from, and it's where we can get back to. Try catch is still not quite the same as native JavaScript or synchronous JavaScript. You still have to chain a catch off of it, and then off of that for the final end. But it's close, and you can get there fairly easily. If you just cast your function's parameter, so in this case we're creating get latest grade here. If you cast the parameter to a function, if you cast the parameter to a promise, and you return that promise, that's really all it takes. Within there you put your logic in a .then, so that once the promise resolves that you've been passed, you can handle your logic on its return value. And you return the promise so that in the future you can use that promise in another function. Then you just put your get latest grade logic inside of them, and everybody's a really happy camper. So that's what I've got for you today. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
In the context of using a promise as a return model of an Ember, so a router, if you were having to do multiple chains of either promises, or you're just handling in a single .then function, do something with the results, but you're also returning that promise from your model book. In which order does the setup controller versus the function callback, with promises, which happens first, or they happen? I guess they can't happen in parallel.
Right. In the context of Ember, if you return a promise or a chain of promises from your model book, Ember's resolver will actually wait for that promise to resolve before passing that value to your setup controller. So if you have a promise that doesn't resolve for a set timeout of 10 seconds, your setup controller will wait for 10 seconds before it resolves. There's an update coming to Ember soon that has lazy routing, so that at least your URL will change before then. But the setup controller hook and all the template rendering does not happen until whatever promises you've returned from the model hook resolve.
Right. So what I was kind of getting at was understanding that when it resolves, you have your .then your resolved successfully, and you have a function callback in your model hook. You're returning that same promise as your hook to your model. When you're returning that, it is technically resolved and it would hit setup controller. But you also have this code that you're running in that function callback of your promise.
Yes.
I'm trying to figure out, one thing I've been curious about with promises is which is actually running first.
I'm fairly certain that promises will wait for the call stack to be empty before fulfilling with a then handler. So I believe that if you had, for example, in this slide, that they had the something else in the middle of it. Let's see if we can find that. Here. So if this was actually a whole lot of code, this is kind of what you're talking about, except you're returning the promise here, or you're returning the promise here, and then you have extra code here?
No, we actually get rid of something else, return the promise up there, return the get JSON, whatever, and then your onFulfilled method actually had some code that was running in the model hook.
Oh, yes. Okay, yeah, it'll wait for the very last fulfilled handler to resolve before passing it over to set up controller.
Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I misunderstood the question.
Sure, yeah, because it kind of resolves and it runs that code, but it also resolves and goes to set up controller. So it wasn't.
Yeah. It'll resolve, in this example, it'll resolve get JSON, and then it will wait for your onFulfilled to resolve, and then it will pass that promise to the set up controller.
Okay. Good.
Very good question.
Thanks.
Anybody else? All right, thank you very much. I recommend you use promises in all your projects, not just Ember.